Well, hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing today? Good. Those of you watching online, thank you so much for joining us today, for being a part of our service. My name's Seth. If we haven't had the opportunity to meet, and as you already figured out, we are beginning a brand new series called Me and My Big Mouth. Now, I'm just curious, do you know anybody with a big mouth? How many of you know somebody with a big mouth? How many of you, that person is sitting right next to you? Just kidding. You don't have to answer that. That would get you into trouble. We don't want to do that. How many of you, the person with the big mouth is the person raising your hand? Yeah, I mean, how many of you can admit that you kind of have a big mouth? Yeah, this series is called Me and My Big Mouth for a reason, because it's not about your neighbor and their big mouth, or your spouse and his or her big mouth, or your boss and his big mouth, or whoever, your kids and their big mouths. It's about me and my big mouth. So we're going to do something a little unusual. I'm going to ask you to say the title of the series with me, okay? On the count of 3. I just want you to say it with me so we can all get on the same page. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Me and my big mouth. Now, that was okay, but I think we were missing some emphasis on the me and my. So let's just do it one more time, just so you can really let it sink in. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Me and my big mouth. And somebody's pointing to herself back there. I love that. Yeah, that is so true. Because again, this isn't about anyone else and their big mouths. It's about you and your big mouth and me and my big mouth, because I actually have a pretty big mouth, as you probably figured out already, which is why they let me up here, maybe, I don't know, every week or so, to share with what's going on in my big mouth. Now, for me, I learned how to use my big mouth because I had 2 big brothers who had bigger muscles than I had. And so my big mouth was the way that I counteracted my lack of physique, right? And so I learned how to use my big mouth to, kind of dig in at people and to get the barb in. And what I would do is I would find the hole in the armor, the chink in the armor, and then I would go for it, whether it was something emotional or something physical that you can't even help, whether it was something, about them, and I would just pick it out and I would stick that knife in and I would twist and I would say the thing that would just absolutely hurt and was painful. And I just learned how to use my big mouth for something that you probably learned to use your big mouth for, and that is to inflict pain on others. That's what I loved using my big mouth for. And over time, I realized that I was actually pretty good at it, because if I couldn't hurt you physically, at least I could hurt you emotionally. And in my family growing up, we had a way of being kind of sarcastic with each other. And the good thing about sarcasm is you can kind of throw your barb in and everybody laughs at the same time. It doesn't maybe feel as pointed or as hurtful. And there's this one experience, and it involved my mom. And Mom, I know you're watching, probably. So you know this story. You're familiar with it. It's kind of a funny story. So one day we were driving. It was me and my mom. She's in the passenger seat. And if you know my mom, you know that she likes to drive even when she's not in the driver's seat. And I think if we had a dummy steering wheel right there, she'd probably grip onto it. And she definitely has put her foot on the imaginary brakes on more than one occasion. So we're at this stop sign. And as we're stopped at this stop sign, I'm like leaning forward to see if it's safe to go. And my mom, at the same time, she's trying to drive, and she's leaning forward to see if it's safe for me to go. And I couldn't see. And she says, "It's not safe yet." And I said to her, "Well, if you would move your big fat head, then maybe I would have known that." We've had many good laughs over that over the years. That would be one of the times where it was just for fun. Anyway, the thing that I have discovered, the thing that you absolutely know, we all know, is that words are powerful, right? I mean, words are powerful, and they can be used for good, or they can be used for bad. They can be used to tear down other people. They can be used to build up other people, and words have had a profound impact just on the world. I mean, words like "I have a dream," right? I mean, think about the impact that those words have had on our culture, our country. Or "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." Words like "Let there be light," or "God is love." I mean, those powerful words have rippled across the centuries. Or even more recently, more complicated words such as "I can't breathe." And the pain that words can cause, and the emotional movement that words can create. Words are so powerful. But again, this series is not about words in general. It's about your words and mine. They're about me and my big mouth, about you and your big mouth. And so as much as it might be tempting to think about other people's words with everything we're going to talk about today, I just want to encourage you to revert back to the idea that this is about me and my big mouth and you and your big mouth. Now, one of the fun things for me as a parent has been watching my kids grow up. I'm a psychology major from college, and so I love watching development. I love seeing words develop within kids. And kids, as their words develop, they learn to say like 3 things immediately. The first one's usually mama. The second one, hopefully, is dada. And then the third one, anybody know what the third word is? No, you are absolutely right. It's the word no. They learn how to control their environments with that word no. And a couple weeks ago, Carrie and I took our youngest, Caden, who's about 2.5 years old. His sisters were out of town. We took him to go get ice cream. And the person at McDonald's gave him this massive ice cream cone, and so we helped him out by eating the top of it. And then we let him have the cone, but he had never had a cone before. And so he's like licking it, and he wouldn't bite the cake cone, and it was becoming this slobbery mess. And so after about 15 minutes, we're like, okay, we're done with this. We're just going to throw the cone out because neither of us wants to eat a slobbery mess cone. And so I said to Caden, okay, buddy, throw your cone in the trash can. And he looked at me, and that sweet, wonderful little boy said, no, I don't want to. I take ice cream cone. And so I picked him up and held him over the trash can. I said, if you don't throw it in there, I'm throwing you in this trash can. I'm kidding. I didn't actually say that. But what's funny, yeah, I'd be a terrible parent. But instead, his cone went in there, so I'm not so terrible. But my point with that is words are powerful, and not just in general. Your words are powerful. Your words are powerful. You know how powerful words are because words have been spoken to you that you still live with today. Right? They've controlled your future. They controlled your career. Sometimes they control your self-esteem, your self-image. They control so many things. But again, this isn't just about other people's words. It's about you and your words. Your words maybe helped you pass a class. They helped you pass English, hopefully. Maybe they got you into college. Maybe they got you in trouble with your parents or a police officer because you kept using your words and you wouldn't shut up with your words, and you had to get the last word in with your words. Maybe they got you a job or lost you a job. Maybe they got you a date or lost you a date. Helped you make friends, cost you some friends. Words are powerful. The other thing I've learned about words is that words are many. Do you know how many words on average we speak in a day? 16,000. Which means if you're awake for 16 hours, you're getting 8 hours of sleep, which might be a bad assumption. But if you're getting 16 hours or 8 hours of sleep, you're awake 16 hours a day, that means you're using between 13 and 15 words per minute. Now, some of you, you're above average, right? And I mean that in the nicest possible way. You're above average, and you're probably connected to somebody who's below average, and you're wondering, why your below average person you're connected to doesn't talk a little bit more. And the thing is, they're not telling you is that you're just sucking all the air out of the room, and there's just not room for anything else. And so because of that, whatever, we're all whatever. So on average, the average book is about 250 pages. And so if we on average, and we'll just assume you're an average person, if you're speaking 16,000 words a day, that means you're writing about 100 books a year. 100 books a year. So the question I have for you is, what are you saying in your 100 books? And is what you're saying worth reading? Is what you're saying worth hearing? Is what you're saying worth listening to? Are the words you use building up or tearing down? Are the things you say to the benefit of other people or to their detriment? Are you using them as tools or as weapons? So the last thing I want to focus on, the third thing, and this is really the focus for today, the third thing that I've learned about words, and quite honestly, if I had learned this a lot sooner, my life would be a lot better, and I would have a lot fewer bad habits in my life that I'm constantly working to break and to correct. And it's this idea here. It's that your words are radioactive. Now, let me explain this a little bit. If you don't know what something being radioactive means, radioactive things decay, and they have what's called a half-life. And so after a certain amount of times, half of whatever that radioactive thing is goes away. And then after that same amount of time, half of whatever's left goes away. And the point is that radioactive things never fully go away, do they? And as I mentioned earlier, you can think of words that were spoken to you or that were spoken over you that never actually went away. Maybe the pain of them has gone away a little bit. Maybe you don't think about them quite as much as you used to, but they still stick with you. And there are still times when they come up. Things that were spoken to you when you were in elementary school, when you were a teenager, 50 years ago. It was your first spouse or your second, I don't know, whatever relationship it was. And there was something that was spoken to you that sticks to you. And what's funny is we know this about other people's words, but somehow we think that our words won't have the same lasting effect. We think that we can speak our words and they just go out into the atmosphere and they disappear. And we forget that the words we speak, because remember, this is me and my big mouth, the words we speak have a lasting impact on those to whom we speak them. In fact, let me ask you a question. How long do you think your words last after they've been spoken? Ever thought about that? How long after you speak your words? Again, we think we know other people's words last a long time, but for ourselves, we use our words somewhat carelessly. And we use our words in a way that betrays what we know and what we have experienced. What's the half-life of bragging? What's the half-life of critical words? What's the half-life of sarcasm? What's the half-life of encouragement? What's the half-life of building others up? Not all words carry the same half-life, and so that's why we have to be so very careful. So I want to dig into this question a little bit today, and I want to push us in this direction that I think is going to help set the framework for this entire series, and I'm going to tell you a story from Jewish antiquity. Now, this is a real true story. This is a real true story, but with the caveat, I'm using it in an allegorical way, and I think it will all make sense. And so throughout this, you're going to be like, where is he going with that? Trust me, it will all come together in the end, and it will make total sense. So if you know much about the history of Israel, let me just say, it started with a man named Abraham. Abraham had a son, and his sons were the leaders of kind of this family. It grew into a nation of people. There were some judges who led them, and eventually some kings. Perhaps you've heard of the kings of Israel. One was Saul. One was King David, who fought Goliath. David had a son whose name was Solomon. He was a very famous king. Well, after Solomon reigned, the kingdom of Israel was split into two. There was a northern kingdom known as Israel, and there was a southern kingdom known as Judah. So the northern kingdom, they had a series of just terrible kings who moved people away from the direction of God. And so as a result, the northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians in 722 BC, never to be restored again. The southern kingdom, which was referred to as Judah, and that's from which we get the term Judaism, the southern kingdom had some good kings, it had some bad kings, and in 586 BC, they were ultimately conquered by the Babylonians and King Nebuchadnezzar, but that's another story for another day. Eventually, they were restored back, and that's the nation of Israel that we refer to even today. So there was a king from the southern kingdom, from Judah, whose name was Hezekiah, and he was one of the last kings, and he was also one of the best kings. He reigned from about 715 to 686 BC. He was 25 years old when he became a king. And what's interesting is, as he was growing up, he saw the unfaithfulness of their northern neighbors, their relatives in the north. He saw them conquered by the Assyrians because of their lack of faithfulness to God. And so when Hezekiah became a king, he wanted to bring restoration to the nation and to the people. And so he redirected people in the direction of God. One of the things he did was to reinstate the Passover and the celebration of the Passover. They invited the north to participate, what was left of the north anyway, and they didn't want anything to do with it. And so after the Passover celebration, they went around the kingdom. They tore down the altars to false foreign gods. And then after that, here's what's said about King Hezekiah from 2 Kings chapter 18. Hezekiah trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. He held fast to the Lord and did not stop following him. He kept the commands the Lord had given to Moses. And then continuing on, the text says, and the Lord was with him. He was successful in whatever he undertook because God's blessing was with him. Hezekiah used the power of his words to bring the nation of Israel back in the right direction, back in the direction of submission to God. Well, the Assyrian king at the time when Hezekiah became the king was named Sargon II, which is just a bad name, isn't it? I mean, he just sounds like a bad dude because of the name Sargon II. And he had a son named Sennacherib, and this is kind of a cool piece, and this is a bit of a side note, but it's kind of fun. There are Assyrian documents from this time period that document Hezekiah being the king of Israel. As I said, this is an absolutely true story. So Sennacherib decided to attack the land of Palestine in 701 BC. And Hezekiah realized that this army of Assyrians was coming, and he saw what had happened in the north. And so he, in the city of Jerusalem, decided to fortify the walls of Jerusalem and to figure out a way to get water into the city. And so they built an aqueduct that ended at the pool of Siloam. And this is still here to this day. This is the pool of Siloam. This is the aqueduct. You can see a tourist walking through there. And what's so cool about this is they went through solid bedrock. Now consider, this is 2,700 years ago. They went over a half kilometer through solid bedrock. They started on opposite ends, and they met in the middle. In fact, it is not a straight shot. It's a snake that goes through, and somehow the engineers were so remarkably good at what they did, they were able to make the tunnels meet, and there's a plaque to the engineers inside that tunnel. So just kind of a tidbit of history. So while they're being under siege by the Assyrians, they're holed up in the city of Jerusalem, Hezekiah becomes sick. He becomes deathly sick. And so he prayed, before that happened, the prophet Isaiah came to him, and Isaiah, for whom we have a book in our Old Testament, Isaiah came to him and said, look, Hezekiah, you're going to lose your life. Just be prepared. Your time is over. Your days are numbered. This disease will kill you. And as anyone who receives news of a terminal illness would do, Hezekiah was devastated, and he began to pray. And here's what he prayed. Hezekiah turned his face to the wall, and he prayed to the Lord, remember, Lord, how I have walked before you faithfully with wholehearted devotion and have done what is good in your eyes. And Hezekiah wept bitterly. I mean, he looked at his life, he looked at all the good he had done for the nation of Israel, and he prayed, God, remember all that stuff. And he wept. He was upset that his life was being taken. Well, perhaps to his surprise, or perhaps not, God actually listened to Hezekiah's prayer. And so the text continues that before Isaiah had left the middle court, the word of the Lord came to him. And here's what the word of the Lord said. Go back and tell Hezekiah, the ruler of my people, this is what the Lord, the God of your father David says. I have heard your prayer and seen your tears. I will heal you. On the third day from now, you will go up to the temple of the Lord. Continuing on, he says, and I will add 15 years to your life. I will deliver you and this city from the hand of the king of Assyria. I will defend this city for my sake and for the sake of my servant David. Hezekiah, I have heard your prayer, and I am going to oblige, and I am going to heal you. Now, just again as a side note, if you've ever wondered if God hears your prayers, the answer is yes. The answer is yes. And when we bring our request to him, which was an invitation that Jesus gave to every single one of us, he hears our prayers, and you never know if you might move the heart and hand of God. And that is exactly what happened in Hezekiah's life. God obliged. God brought healing to him. There was a message that there was going to be this miraculous sign that this healing was going to take place. And the miraculous sign was that the sun would step back 10 steps rather than forward 10 steps on a given day. And that actually happened. And people around saw it happen. And news came about that Hezekiah had been healed. And there was this great celebration, not altogether undifferent than if somebody comes home from the hospital healed or finishing their final chemotherapy treatment. I mean, it was a celebration. And so the nation of Babylon heard about that, and they sent an envoy to celebrate. And that's where the story gets interesting. Here's what happened. At that time, Marduk-Baladan, son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent Hezekiah letters and a gift because he had heard of Hezekiah's illness. This is like the get-well gift. And if we're honest, this is an attempt to kind of buy a friendship with the nation of Israel so that they could be mutually beneficial to one another. So when Hezekiah welcomed this entourage, things maybe went in a bad direction. Verse 13, the text tells us that Hezekiah received the envoys and showed them all that was in his storehouses. The silver, the gold, the spices, and the fine olive oil, continuing on, his armory, and everything found among his treasures. There was nothing in his palace or in all his kingdom that Hezekiah did not show them. Now, I can just imagine how the conversation went, and I may be reading between the lines, but it could be that as Hezekiah and his people were welcoming these people from Babylonia and their entourage, their envoy, They look around, they say, wow, Hezekiah, what a beautiful palace. Well, I love your gold-plated doors. Hezekiah, what a beautiful family you have. Your sons are so handsome. Your daughters are so beautiful, Hezekiah. And he's thinking to himself, yeah, we are pretty great. Why don't I show you around? Why don't I just take you, let me give you the grand tour. Let me show you my treasuries. Let me show you everything that I have here. It's kind of like when somebody comes over and you want to impress them with, the 57 Chevy in the garage or the gun collection or whatever it is that you're most proud of, and you take them around and you show them everything. I mean, he's flattered. He's flattered. And you know what? He had an incredible amount of wealth. The book of 2 Chronicles accounts how much wealth he had. Here's what it says. Hezekiah had very great wealth and honor, and he made treasuries for his silver and gold and for his precious stones, spices, shields, and all kinds of valuables. He also made buildings to store the harvest of grain, new wine, and olive oil, and he made stalls for various kinds of cattle and pens for the flocks. He built villages and acquired great numbers of flocks and herds, for God had given him very great riches. I mean, God had blessed him, but that's the thing that Hezekiah missed. He missed the point at the end, right here, that God had given him very great riches. Who gave him the great riches? God. God had given him the great riches, but who took responsibility and who took the accolades for what had been given? Hezekiah did. And his words were incredibly prideful, and the consequences were significant. The prophet Isaiah heard about the envoy that had come, and he began confronting Hezekiah. Here's what took place. Isaiah said, "What did those men say, and where did they come from?" "From a distant land," Hezekiah replied. "They came from Babylon." And then the prophet asked, continuing on, "What did they see in your palace?" "They saw everything in my palace," Hezekiah said. "I gave them the grand tour. There is nothing among my treasures that I did not show them." Now again, this was a big mistake from a really big mouth. As he sought to impress, as he sought to show off, as he sought to brag about what it was that he had and what it was that he had accomplished. Now, if we just pause here for a second, and if we just think about our own words, I mean, isn't that kind of where we get in trouble too? When we're trying to impress? Isn't that why we criticize others and the things that they do, because it makes us look good and it makes us look awesome? That's why we make those mic drop comments and walk away. We're so great. And that's exactly what Hezekiah was doing. But Hezekiah did not fool God. In fact, Isaiah said this. He said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord. The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all that your predecessors have stored up until this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord." And true to history, in 586, this took place. "And some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, who will be born to you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." Hezekiah, what you've done is foolish. What you have done is foolish. All of the good that you have done during your lifetime was lost because of this one poor decision. Everything, Hezekiah, will be taken from you. And you know what's absolutely true? Hezekiah had no idea. He had no idea how far-reaching the consequences of his actions would be. He had no idea. Even though the majority of his life had been used for good and had been used in directing the people back to God, this mistake, his big mouth, got him into trouble. His foolish words would lead to slavery for generations and generations of people to come. But here's what I think is one of the worst parts of the story. And again, this is just my opinion. This last verse here. "The word of the Lord you have spoken is good," Hezekiah replied. To which I want to say, Hezekiah, did you hear what Isaiah just said? I mean, he just said your children, grandchildren, your descendants, they're going to be enslaved in Babylon. And your response is, this is good? The kingdom of Israel would never be restored back to the glory that it had been. But your kingdom is, or this is good? But the text says and explains, for he thought, will there not be peace and security in my lifetime? It's not going to hurt me. What I did isn't going to have a consequence for me, so it's all good. And he had little understanding for the long-term ramifications. Now, at the risk of kind of stating the obvious, as I said, I believe this is a bit allegorical for our conversation today as much as this is a very true story. But I want to go back to the question that I asked at the very beginning, and that is, how long do you think your words last after they've been spoken? And do you know the answer to this? It's pretty simple. Longer than you think. Far longer than you think. Because our words have a half-life. And sometimes our words have a shorter half-life than others. For instance, positive words, for whatever reason, positive words have a very short half-life, don't they? In fact, play along with me for just a second. I want you to think back to your childhood. I want you to think to your parents, or it could even be present day if you want, if your parents are still living and you have a conversation with your parents, or conversations with your parents. Can you think of 5 positive things your parents ever said to you? Give you 5 seconds just to think about 5 positive things your parents ever said to you. Ready? Go. Now, here's the thing I'm guessing, I don't know for sure, unless you grew up with terrible parents. They probably said a lot of positive things to you. They were probably encouraging many times along the path. But those words don't stick with us, do they? Now, if I were to ask you to think about 5 negative things your parents or a friend or a coach or a teacher or someone else you knew spoke to you, can you think of 5 negative things? If I give you 5 seconds, ready, set, go. You probably didn't even need 5 seconds. Throughout this whole message, you've probably been thinking about some of those things because they continue to impact us. They have a much longer half-life. And my point is that your words, my words, if we are not careful with them, if we do not guard and protect what it is that we say, can undo all the good we have done in a relationship. Now, that doesn't mean we never speak truth. I'm not saying, you might be saying, Seth, should we never be honest with each other? Should we just blow each other up all the time and say nice things and puff each other up? Or, do we never be honest? Do we never speak hard things? That's not what I'm saying at all. There are times when we absolutely need to speak hard things, but it's the way we say it, the words we use, and the context in which we use them. Your words, my words, have the power to bring life or to steal it, to build up or to tear down. You get to choose the words you use. From Proverbs chapter 18, verse 20, it says, "From the fruit of their mouth, a person's stomach is filled." Now, to explain this, because it's a little complicated, the fruit of their mouth refers to words. That's the fruit of our mouths, right? That's what comes out of our mouths. From the fruit of their mouth, a person's stomach is filled. The point being that when we say our words, our appetite is satisfied. When we say our words, our appetite is satisfied. And then the second part of this verse is basically repeating the same. With the harvest of their lips, they are satisfied. Again, our words can either be used to bring life or steal it, as a tool or a weapon for good or for bad. But then he goes on and says, the tongue has the power of life and death. The tongue has the power of life and death. He goes on and says, and those who love it. In other words, those who understand this and use it in the right way will eat its fruit. They'll be satisfied. When they understand and use the tongue for good rather than bad, when they use the tongue to build up rather than tear down, as a tool rather than a weapon, they'll eat its fruit. They'll be blessed. They'll be fulfilled. But the thing is, we get to decide, don't we? We get to choose the words we use. And they have a lasting impact. In fact, I want to ask you a rhetorical question. I already know the answer to it, and you absolutely know the answer to it too. And that is, if you could choose how other people use their words with you, what would you choose? I hear some laughing because you know the words you would choose. You would use words to build up rather than tear down. You would choose that they encourage you rather than just criticize. You would choose that they're honest with you, but not in a nasty, hateful way, not at your expense, but because they have your best interest in mind. So if we know that we want this from other people, why wouldn't we give it to other people? If we want other people to build us up with their words, why wouldn't we choose to do the same thing with others? But instead, so often, at least for me, and I can just speak very personally about this series, as I've been planning and preparing it, has really gotten to me because I realize the power of my words and the way that I use my words at times. It's kind of like Hezekiah. Let it all out. Let it all out, right? You feel good about it, don't you? I mean, that's kind of what the author of Proverbs was getting at. It feels good when you let it all out, except that it can bring death to people. And we can be reckless with the way that we use our words, and we can damage other people with the way that we use our words. So don't we have a responsibility, and don't we have an invitation? I mean, all the good Hezekiah had done was undone because of his foolishness with his words. My friends, we have an opportunity to be better than that. Our world needs us to be better than that. Because I get on social media and I look at the news and I follow all kinds of people on Twitter and I look at that and I say, be wise with your words. You are simply criticizing and tearing down. We have an opportunity to build others up. Our church needs that. Our community needs that. Why wouldn't we give it? We want it from them. Why wouldn't we give it to them? So what if this coming week we could really think about our words? In fact, I came up with a little saying, a little rhyming saying John's going to make fun of me for. It's before you start to say a word, pause and ponder what will be heard. I mean, what if we could do this just this week? I'm not asking you to commit to a month of it, but what if just this week, before you start to say a word, you pause and ponder what will be heard? You think about the ramifications of what's coming out of your mouth. You think about your actions and where they might lead and how they might impact the person who's hearing. That as parents, when our kids are driving us crazy and we want to just throw a dart at them with our words, what if we would pause and ponder what they're going to hear? That before we start to say a word, we'd pause and ponder what will be heard. And when your spouse does that thing that drives you crazy, or your boyfriend or your girlfriend does that thing that drives you crazy, or your friends at school, your teammates or whatever, what if we would, before we start to say a word, just pause and ponder what will be heard, and then make a course correction when necessary, because that's the implication here. Don't just pause and think about it and say, okay, I'm going to say it anyway. I mean, the point is that you think about it, and we become wise with our words. Wouldn't our world be a better place if we did this? Wouldn't your life be a better place? Wouldn't your relationships be in a better place if you did this? So, in the spirit of helping you learn this, we're going to say it all together. If somebody told you you wouldn't have to talk if you came, they lied. So, stick that back up there for me. I want you to take a look at this. We're going to say it on the count of 3. Before you start to say a word, pause and ponder what will be heard. Ready? On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Before you start to say a word, pause and ponder what will be heard. One more time. Before you start to say a word, pause and ponder what will be heard. And the reason we need to do this is because our words are radioactive. They have a half-life, and some stick longer than others. And so we have to be careful. We have to pause and ponder and consider carefully what we say and choose wisely. And then I hope you'll choose to be back here next week as we continue part 2 of Me and My Big Mouth. Let me pray for us. Father, I look at all the words that are spoken in our world today. I look at the damage that's being done in homes, in families, in friendships, people from opposing political points of view. What an opportunity we have. What an opportunity we have to use our words differently. So, Father, I just ask that you would help each one of us as we think about the words that we say. This week, would we just pause? Would we stop and pause and ponder and think about the words that we're going to use? And would you help us to use words of life? Thank you, Father, for the challenge and the invitation that this is. Give each one of us wisdom we need to respond in a way that is honoring and pleasing to you. And then, Father, give us the courage to do it. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.